Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first Veg Edge for 2023. My name is Kerri Stewart. I am a registered dietitian and coordinator of the Heart Resource Center. Don Maddox is here joining me as well as a student from USC Upstate this afternoon. So they are here to help support, answer any questions as we go through a delayed version of the sweet potato tempeh lentil chili that was originally promised to you back in, I think, October. So today here in Greer, South Carolina, it is incredibly rainy and gross out. So a perfect day for a nice hearty bowl of stew is probably what I should refer to it as, not chili, because I was reading actually the recipe, and people are very particular about their chili. We got in a big conversation about this. So I've always thought that if it's chili, then it needs to have beans, whether it has beef or not. But there are just a lot of peculiarities throughout the country that go along with chili. So this is probably more like a stew if we are going to classify it as something, but it's going to be really delicious. Like I said, it's the perfect day here for it because the weather is pretty crummy. It's cold, it's rainy. So it will take a little bit of time to cook. I am actually should have probably started my stovetop here a minute ago. And we're going to get this going just on a medium low heat as all of this gets started. And I'm going to walk through what we have. So since it does take a good bit of time to actually simmer in the pot, I've gone ahead and I've pre-chopped a few of my ingredients. I've portioned out a lot of them as well, and some I will get to talking through as the soup is actually cooking. But the first thing we wanted to do was kind of get it rolling. So what we're going to do first, once our pan is warm, is add a little bit of olive oil. If you are doing oil-free, you can completely remove that. I have 8 cups of broth over here, so you could use water to start that process. You could use a little bit of your broth to start that process and eliminate the oil. It's a tablespoon of oil. This recipe is going to serve anywhere from 8 to 10 people, which is quite a bit. So that's the other good thing. There's a decent amount of chopping. There is a decent amount of ingredients. I know it looks like a lot, but it is affordable. It's really nutritious, and you'll get multiple servings out of it unless there are 8 people in your household, in which case you may only get one, but it'll be an affordable recipe for all those 8 people. So I did pre-chop my onion. I've got 5 cloves of garlic going on here. So this is a really immune-friendly recipe. We've got a sweet potato that I did peel, but I've done it before where you don't peel it either, so that's always an option. I've got yellow bell pepper. I went with that because in thinking of the rainbow and trying to get the variety of color, the recipe says a red bell pepper, but we have red tomatoes that are going into this. So I opted for yellow, which we didn't have any colors of otherwise. We've got our white with our onion and our garlic. And so the yellow does actually have different phytochemicals, different compounds that make that bell pepper yellow. So by choosing the green over the red, over the orange, over the yellow, we actually do get different types of those nutrients. So variety is best. So that's how I landed on that. We've got our sweet potato, like I mentioned, and then I'm going to go through some of the spices later. So we'll see where our pan is at here. Doesn't seem like it's quite warm enough, but I'm gonna just go ahead and get this process started. So a little bit of olive oil in the bottom here. I like keeping it in these squirt bottles just because I think it's easier that way. It's not hot yet. It's getting there. Okay. And a good way to check if your pan is where you want it is if the olive oil is actually rolling around almost like water instead of that thicker oil consistency. So mine was actually pretty close to that. So we've got our olive oil going. I'm going to add the onions and the garlic first. I might go ahead and mix these up a little bit. And I can hear it sizzling, so that is a good sign. All right. So pre-chopped my onion and minced 5 garlic cloves by hand. In this case, it's okay if our garlic is a little extra chunky because it's going in the stew. And again, it's going to cook for a while. So even if you get a large bite of garlic and that's not your favorite thing, then you can do a couple of things. You can either use less garlic or you could finely mince it a little bit more. But it's going to cook for a while, so you're not even going to notice if it's a little bit larger. So mincing doesn't have to be perfect in something like a stew or a chili where it's all going to cook for a while. So there's our white compounds going on. I'm going to grab my hot hand here. Okay. So I just wanted to get these coated in the oil a little bit before I start to add all the spices. And in this case, we're adding spices now, not herbs. Herbs, generally speaking, are a lot more tender than spices are. So we're almost activating the spices by letting them mix together with that little bit of heat. This is especially helpful if your spices are a little bit older too. So sometimes that heat can just break it apart. I have some really nice spices that are, I mean, you can choose how much you want to spend on your herbs and spices, but I have to say, if you find some that you really like, if you do pay a little bit more for certain brands, just opening the containers of some of mine, I get this big rush of the scent of the spice, and that's how you know it's fresh. That's how you know that it's going to actually make your food taste like something. If you can't smell it, you're not going to taste it. So almost why I put it in there. But I know they can be pricey. So also activate them by using a little bit of heat there. So we are going to add smoked paprika, which I decided on because we're going to add a little bit of liquid smoke as well. But the smoked paprika is probably one of my favorite spices, especially to go along with sweet potatoes. So the recipe calls for original paprika, but I went with the smoked. I'm going to add 1/4 teaspoon of coriander, which is actually the seed of cilantro. So we call cilantro here in the United States, but in a lot of other places you might just see the word coriander, and it could be referring to the leaves and the stems of the cilantro as well. So these are whole seeds. You could grind them up, but I have pre-ground coriander in this case. Turmeric. So we're going to start to get a beautiful color from that. I'm going to just start to mix this stuff around in here as I keep talking. And I mean, I can smell it already because I was using some really fresh, awesome herbs, or I'm sorry, spices. But I can already smell them even more from the heat. Okay, last thing. Nope, I'm going to do the pepper first. A dash of pepper. So I've got my standard black pepper that I'm just going to sprinkle in there. And then I am using something called bearberry. And this is an Ethiopian blend of spices. There is salt in it. And I'm using that instead of the chili powder. But when I got here, I also realized that I forgot the cumin. So I'm really glad that I made that decision because the bearberry is, let me read it to you. So it's got onion, salt, sea salt, paprika, garlic, coriander. So some of the common spices we've already been using. Chili de arbol, green cardamom, fenugreek seed, black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, allspice, and nutmeg. And so when I think of chili, I do think of cumin. I do think of maybe some more traditional Mexican flavors or spices, but this is going to add a really different twist on it. But at the same time, it's got, sometimes depending on where you're at in the United States, people like to add cinnamon to their chili. So it's almost going to add some of these extra flavors that we do think of when we think of chili, depending on where you're at. And some of the bearberry spice blends actually have cumin in them. Mine does not, but some of them do. So this I'm really excited to see how this goes. I've never done this before, but as I was digging through my pantry and figuring out what I wanted to bring, this caught my eye. And just in thinking about what we're putting into this dish, I decided to go for it. So it's going to be great. I'm going to add a little bit of liquid smoke. Liquid smoke, if you've never used this before, is almost like the savory version of vanilla extract. Normally, what I would do is tell you to taste things as you go. But some ingredients just don't really taste great on their own, or they might be very in your face. And this is one of them. So we're using a really small amount, 1/4 of a teaspoon for the entire dish. But again, I do like that smoky flavor. If you don't love the smoky flavor, you can completely leave it out. You could do your regular paprika instead of your smoked paprika as well. So keep that in mind there. All right, we're gonna let these soften a little bit more. And I'm gonna give it a stir. I'm starting to stick to the bottom a little bit, which is not a bad thing because we are going to do what's called deglaze our pan here in a minute with the tomatoes. And I think I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now. So, actually, okay, nope, sorry. We're gonna add some of our bell pepper and our sweet potatoes. Again, I just diced these up. I tried to cut the sweet potato in fairly small pieces, and I think I am going to add a little bit of broth just to make sure I'm not burning anything, because we wouldn't want that. So that's a good little trick. You don't want your spices to stick to the bottom of your pan and start to burn. So you can use a couple of different things to help prevent that from happening. You could just use water. You could use broth. We could use the canned tomatoes in a second, but since I'm supposed to be sauteing my sweet potatoes and my onions, my garlic, my bell pepper together, I just went ahead and added a little bit of that broth while it was there. Okay. This looks awesome already. It smells awesome. I think the bearberry was a really great choice. And again, that is a traditional Ethiopian spice blend. So when you're using a spice blend, again, it can have different amounts, different ratios of spices or herbs or salt. Salt was the second ingredient on here, so that tells me without a nutrition facts label that there's probably a decent amount of sodium, but we're using low sodium broth, and we're using the canned tomatoes have a little bit of sodium, but that is spread out within 8 servings. So this is still going to fall well with under that 600 to 700 milligram range of sodium per meal per day. So that's a good thing there. And back to my liquid smoke. Liquid smoke does not have any sodium in it. At least mine does not, this version that I have. And so the reason I liken it to vanilla extract is because vanilla extract makes everything taste better. But if you stuck your finger in there and you tasted the vanilla extract, it would be very shocking, and it does not taste good just by itself. So I still taste liquid smoke in my mouth after I realized I had never tasted it by itself before. So while I was prepping all of this, I decided I was going to do that. And you know what? It is not a great taste. It's very powerful. So that's why less is best. Start with just a little bit. You could even just do a couple drops if the 1/4 of a teaspoon made you nervous and you don't love smoky flavors. If you don't love smoky flavors, again, you can completely omit that. So those are the herbs. Nope. Those are the spices that we have going into our dish. And so, all right, I'm gonna check on these, see how we're doing over here. Make sure that they're starting to soften. I think I'm gonna crank it back up a little bit now that I have a little bit of my broth in there. But there's gonna be plenty of liquid that will cook around this too. So right now we're really sauteing just to give a little bit of flavor, let those natural sugars in our vegetables caramelize, bring out the flavors of the spices going on in there. And This is a dish I've made multiple times, and I'm excited because I'm making it a pretty different way this time with some new ingredients that I haven't done before. I got this recipe from Produce on Parade, a blog, and have adapted it a little bit, but did want to let you know where I got it from. And then, all right, so I'm gonna pour in the tomatoes. Okay. So the recipe calls for 2 15-ounce can of no salt added diced tomatoes, which you can absolutely do. Again, I'm all about these flavors. So I chose to do 1 larger can, which is technically only 28 ounces, of fire roasted tomatoes. The fire roasted tomatoes also have a flavor just from the cooking process that brings out a lot of extra depth in what you're going to taste. So especially for a chili or a stew, really for a lot of things, I like the fire roasted a little bit better than just the plain diced tomatoes, but you can absolutely do that as well. So I'm going to stir those in there. And I do need to add my tempeh. So let's talk tempeh here for a minute. Okay. And Catherine, if you don't mind, will you hop on the mat over here and zoom in for me? Thank you. So I have tempeh here, and this is down. Okay, how's that? Word. Okay, so tempeh is a fermented soy product. And the 2 ingredients, this is not usually the brand that I buy, but it was what was at the store. So that is what I have this time. But this one is only 2 ingredients. So it is cultured organic soybeans and water. You'll notice that it's much more compact than tofu. It's much more firm than tofu. And as a fermented product, what I really want to make sure that you are aware of is that there might be some discoloration that you see. And in mine, there is. It is completely natural and normal. It is totally fine. It is a fermented product, and that is all that it is, just causing that discoloration there. So I'm going to break into this. Then we're going to talk tempeh a little bit more. All right. So tempeh is originally from Indonesia. That is the first documented historical record of using the word tempeh, and what it is comes from the 19th century of Indonesia. So the word tempeh is Javanese. And there we go. Okay. So all I'm going to do is crumble this up by hand. You can certainly cut it. I'm going to put that in there. Move my knife out of the way because I really don't need my knife anymore. It's been in the United States since the 1970s. And so, of course, once you hear about the nutrition of it, you'll realize why vegetarians and other plant-based folks latched onto it. So here you can see that you almost are getting this whole soybean. So it's definitely got a different texture. It's got a different flavor. I personally do like to crumble it up into dishes. And this is a great activity for smaller children to do to help you out. Tempeh can be eaten by itself, but it's not the most appetizing that way. So what it's really good at, similar to tofu, is absorbing the flavors that you give it. So in this case, we're giving it all of these smoky, lovely, incredible, spicy flavors. Not spicy as in heat. This is not a hot, spicy recipe. Just spicy as in lots going on there. So I'm just crumbling it up by hand because that's honestly the easiest thing to do. It'll start to naturally fall apart. And tempeh has 17 grams of protein. This specific kind that I have, but they're all pretty similar. 17 grams of protein in 1/3 of this block, 4 grams of fiber. So it's got a significant amount more of protein than standard tofu does. And then the fermentation process actually helps to start break down some of these fibers. It helps break down some of the thicker outer shells of the bean itself, which actually enables us and our digestive tract and our gut bacteria to absorb some of the minerals and the vitamins and even the fibers better. There's only 10 grams of carbohydrates in one of the servings of it, and that was 4 of that is fiber. So really high protein food. I know we hear a lot in the plant-based world that it's hard to get enough protein, and so tempeh could easily be your solution to that. It's got kind of a nutty flavor if you eat it by itself. Right now I'm just picking on it, but there's no need to do that. So here is my tempeh. I'm going to hold it up one more time. And that way you can get a little sense of what it is before we actually put it in the stew. So I do, again, like to, it will absorb flavors, even though it's fermented, it's a little bit tighter and kind of thicker than tofu. But I do like to add it to certain dishes. People have recipes with homemade tempeh bacon. Again, not really bacon-esque per se, but still delicious. Okay, I'm just. Mm. So I heard we were talking about steaming it. So that is a great option. And almost, and mixing it into all of this, we're going to steam it a little bit, but also simmer it with all sorts of flavors going on. Okay. So I have mixed all of my ingredients up until this point together pretty well. I'm going to wash my hands because it is a little bit sticky with the tempeh. So let me do that. And yes, please feel free to write in any of your ways that you have enjoyed tempeh before. I would love to hear that. I make a version of lettuce wraps, kind of Asian style lettuce wraps that use the tempeh. And I do feel like because it has a more meaty texture, it's just more concentrated than tofu, which can be soft and spongy. And, there are ways to make tofu a little firmer, but this is very much that bean, kind of like that whole bean flavor or texture, excuse me. So I think that's helpful to use it in different ways that you might already use ground meat. I've done tempeh nachos, so given it again a lot of those Mexican flavors, and then added it to my chips with all my other fun toppings that way. So that was something with a strong flavor and I don't want to say that it tastes bad, but it's got a distinct flavor, whereas tofu I feel like doesn't taste like a whole lot. The tempeh does come with its own flavor because it's been fermented. So anything you think about being fermented, generally think of something as having a strong flavor. So in this case, it's not very strong necessarily, but it does come with its own flavor to begin with. So I just want to make that clear. Okay. So tempeh you would purchase in the grocery store, and the produce section is normally where you're going to find it, or sometimes near the dairy if you're in like a specialty store, wherever the tofu is located. So you could ask about that. But most stores, your standard grocery stores, are going to carry it, and that's where you'll find it. It is relatively affordable, which is great. And so give it a try. Okay, let me see where we're at right now. So I've got my tempeh, peppers, sweet potato in there. We've got our tomatoes. We are now going to add broth and lentils, and then we're going to bring it to a boil. So this recipe does actually as originally written, calls for red lentils. I hardly ever have those. I was in the store yesterday and the red lentils were the same price as the green lentils where I was at. So I went with the red lentils. So that is one tweak that I have actually never tried before, but is the way it was originally written. Normally I use just the regular standard green lentils and super affordable, very easy. So we're adding 2 cups of lentils and I have rinsed these off. So I'm going to have to kind of chip away at them because now their starches have started to come out. Actually, let me get my other spoon. And you do always want to rinse your lentils, your dried beans, even some of your grains. Just check the back of the bag and see what the bag or the box or whatever they came in says. Because sometimes these things have been pre-rinsed, which, then it can't hurt to rinse it again just in case. But in a lot of times, especially with dried beans and whatnot, they've actually never been rinsed off before. So by doing that, we're just making sure there's no extra dirt, no getting maybe some of the pesticides or whatnot off if needed. So that. All right, I'm going to add broth, and I'll talk about my broth here in a minute. So this pot is about to be almost full. So that is how much this makes. So I'm going to crank this up right now. And we'll keep our eye on that for when it actually starts to boil.
Hannah made the point that she made a vegan pot roast with tempeh in a crock pot last week, and it was phenom.
Really? I'm intrigued by that. So did you keep it like a whole block or it was almost just like your potatoes and carrots and your standard pot roast ingredients, but with the tofu broken up? Did the tofu stay in? I do feel like the tofu is a little bit better at staying. So if you need something to hold its shape, like a cube versus breaking apart into the liquid, sometimes the tempeh can do a little bit better for that. Okay. My broth has turmeric in it, which if you've ever worked with turmeric before, you know that is a beautiful color. Part of the reason turmeric is so awesome for us is because of that bright orange color, but it can stain. So just trying to get it off of my lovely white countertop here before it's stained too much. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other ingredients, kind of going down the line here while we wait for our pot to boil. So again, I mentioned that I did red lentils. Now, these red lentils, sometimes, again, it's really interesting. There can be varying nutrition facts on even package to package, but in this case, 1/4 of a cup dry has 8 grams of fiber in it. So that's quite impressive. 9 grams of protein. So again, we're adding, now on top of the tempeh, we're adding even more protein with our lentils. And no matter what color lentil you're getting, it's going to be a high protein source. One of my favorite things about lentils, no matter what color they are, is that unlike your dried beans, you don't have to soak them. And then one thing about the red lentils and then the little black French lentils, those usually cook faster than your traditional green lentils. So I actually do expect this to cook a little bit faster compared to when I use the standard green lentils. So that's a good thing there. If you were just cooking your lentils on the stovetop, bring them to a boil, bring them back down to a simmer. They're 1 part lentil, 2 parts liquid, and they'll cook up in 15-20 minutes and are done. So versus that whole process of all the dried beans where you might have to soak them or quick cook them, quick boil them, and then let them simmer, or the Instant Pot is a great way, but even in the Instant Pot, it can take a little bit of time. So lentils can be a go-to, great substitution. So in this case, we do have a bean in our chili, but it's not necessarily what we would think of as a chili bean either. So great way to experience lentils if that is not an item you have tried before. And again, we have different color lentils. So different color lentils mean they have different phytonutrients that are giving them those colors. So variety is better when it comes to that too. We went through a lot of our spices. Let me talk about the broth here for a minute as well. So broth can be really expensive when it's just, $2 or more for a carton. This is a lot of stew, so it used 8 cups of broth. So I actually bought these little bouillon cubes, and 1 cup has 105 milligrams of sodium. So that means the entire, quart of broth would have 400 or so milligrams of sodium, which that's pretty common for the whole container. We're not going to eat 4 cups of it. We're going to eat less than that. So in that case, it's completely fine. So I boiled the water in the same pot first, actually, and then I used those glass jars that you saw, and I whisked the bouillon together. I don't know why, but this is something that I didn't grow up doing. We didn't do the bouillon cubes in my house. My mom just always bought the cartons of broth or stock. So I do make my own broth when I can now, but that takes a while to build up your vegetable scraps to be able to have enough. And even in a pot about this size, your broth, you're only going to get probably 1.5 quarts, maybe 2 quarts. So maybe that 8 cups of broth out of a pan that has vegetable scraps or a pot that has vegetable scraps this large. So it just takes a while to build up all those scraps. I have a Ziploc freezer bag. If I'm chopping anything, I throw them in there and put them in the freezer, and I just take it back out. So that's another reason I try to chop a lot of things at one time, is then I can fill up my broth fill up my bag with a lot of those scraps at once, keep them in there, and then I don't forget, because that's always a bummer when I'm chopping something and I've thrown it away and I forgot to add it to my broth bag when it could have been there. I'll put cilantro stems in it, parsley stems, rosemary sprigs, stems in there. I would put a couple of those sweet potato peelings in there. You can absolutely do that. So I know sometimes the recipes say don't add a bunch of starchy items, and that's fine. Don't add a bunch of starchy items overall, but I've done corn cobs in there as well. So there's a lot of things you could do with your broth. This little box, I'm just going to give this a stir. All right. This little box cost me the same amount as 1 of the quarts of broth was going to cost. And so now I can make this recipe again, and I have all the broth that I need right there for literally 1/4 of the price at that point. So that's a great thing there. And you could also do sometimes they have the jars that you could use that's almost like a paste where you're doing the same thing. So yes, it does take one extra step. Yes, if I'm somewhere where the broth is very affordable, I'll probably just grab a box or 2 to keep it on hand, because you don't always know when you're going to need it. But if you do have those extra moments, it really is more cost effective to do it that way. So that is what I went with over there. And then, so let's talk colors a little bit more. Again, we're going to end up getting a pretty decent amount of colors going on here. So we've got red with our tomatoes. We've got orange with our sweet potato, yellow with our bell pepper. We do have the lentils, which are red as well. We've got our turmeric, which is orange. We've got some of these spices, paprika, and some of the chili peppers in our spices would be red as well. And then we're going to top it with cilantro. So that may not be a standard chili topping for everyone either, but I am very much a cilantro person. So we've got some green in there. Oh, and white. So we had our onion and we had our garlic. So really quite a decent job at getting a rainbow into this dish. And one of the interesting things about orange foods is that with every 1/2 of a cup consumption, we're lowering our risk for cardiovascular disease, for coronary heart disease. So the way that the plaque actually begins to build up in our arteries, we lower that with every half of a cup we are consuming per day. So a half a cup isn't a whole lot, and that could look like a sweet potato hash at breakfast. You could have carrot sticks at lunch, and then you could have stew, chili, something like that for dinner, and you're getting now at least a cup and a half there. So the other thing about orange is that they're very immune friendly. So the carotenoids, they're called, not only are those very anti-inflammatory, that's part of the reason that we think that they're so heart friendly, is because the process of plaque buildup in our arteries is very inflammatory. So if we can prevent that inflammation from occurring, sometimes we can prevent the plaque buildup in the way it would normally happen. So carotenoids, those are the phytonutrients. So what gives those orange foods that color, that's a class of them. There's tons of them. Beta carotene is one you might have heard of. That is a class of carotenoid. And so that plus the immune response, the carotenoids are really powerful immune system reactors. So they can almost activate cancer cells and types of our immune system that will go seek out cells that are abnormal and tell them, hey, get rid of this. This doesn't really look right. And that is how cancer starts to form. So tumors start to form in that way. So we have these abnormal cells that just don't quite look right, and they're replicating over time. But carotenoids can kind of come in, rush in, prevent that process from happening. And then, right now, unfortunately, there's a lot of viruses that are going around. So we can use all of the immune system boost that we can to either get over something a little bit quicker if we do end up getting the flu or COVID or RSV, or hopefully prevent them from happening too. So orange, really, really powerful in that way. Orange is also very powerful for particularly reproductive cancers. So for men, that would be prostate cancer. For women, we're talking breast, ovarian, uterine cancers too. So eat up your orange foods. All right. We have made it to a simmer over here. So I'm going to just throw the lid on now and crank it down a little bit. We'll listen out for it just in case. But let's see. 12:40. So we won't be talking this long. We'll do a little bit of TV magic, and I'll scoop some out and show you a bowl once I'm done talking tomatoes, and I'll give it a little bit of cilantro here when I'm done that too. So processing sometimes gets a bad rap, but we do have processed canned tomatoes. What that's doing is really evaporating the water out of the tomatoes in some cases, and so it's concentrating the nutrients. So in a half a cup of diced canned tomatoes, you're actually going to get more potassium, you're going to get more fiber, you're going to get more vitamin C, more vitamin A than you would in a half of a cup of raw tomatoes. So yes, there is added sodium in this particular brand, so that might be the downside. But if you're not adding salt in any of the other places of your meal, then you have room for that 600 to 700 milligrams of sodium, which is great. So in terms of red, lycopene is one of those phytonutrients, those very powerful plant compounds that we can get, especially from our red foods. And so I was just reading a study that was talking about the significant improvements in the lining of the blood vessels. So this is called the endothelium. It's a very thin lining of our arteries and really throughout our entire cardiovascular system. And what happens when we start to get plaque buildup is because that endothelial lining is so skinny, it's kind of easy to bust through. So if we have those inflammatory cholesterol molecules, we start to get this response, and the body doesn't really know where to put it. So it kind of pokes a little hole in between the lining, and then we start to get the plaque buildup underneath that little part right there. So with 4 cups of, let me make sure that's right. Yes. 4 servings of tomato juice a week, we saw significant improvement in that lining, in the function of that lining, in the strength of that lining, especially in people with something called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome, you may have heard of that, you may not have, but it's a class of different markers, biomarkers that we're looking at. And if you have 3 or more of the following, then you might have metabolic syndrome. So we're looking at impaired fasting blood sugar is one of them, high triglycerides, low HDL, so low healthy good cholesterol is one of them, high blood pressure. And then if the majority of the fat that you're carrying is around your abdomen, that is another one. So there are, I guess, 5 things that could cause metabolic syndrome, and you have to have 3 out of the 5 or more to consider having that. So tomato juice by itself is not something that I would particularly enjoy drinking 4 times a week, but guess what has tomato juice in it? Canned tomatoes, right? So there could be a reason, if you're a tomato lover, to eat lots and lots of canned tomatoes throughout the week and watch as those numbers will start to improve. But what you might not be able to see is the restoration of that lining of our arteries that is starting to heal itself through that. And I think that's very interesting because previously I was promoting mostly greens and your dark leafy greens, but also some herbs like cilantro and basil in particular as something that can help heal that endothelial lining. So we're gonna, in this case, we're just sprinkling a bit of cilantro on the top. Is it gonna have some nutritional benefit? Absolutely, but it's really just a garnish in this case. And so it's great that we are pairing it with the tomatoes in this case to actually know that we're still getting that good, healthy, heart-healthy healing effect there. So I'm going to actually just tear off a little bit of these cilantro leaves. I did already rinse it all. And then I wanted to show you, this is how I keep my cilantro in my refrigerator, because that is my biggest pet peeve is, you know, you go pay $1, $1.50, something like that, maybe $2 for cilantro. And then it just goes limp because all you needed was a little bit of it. So instead, keep it in a glass of water when you get home from the store. Put the little bag around it that it came in, throw it in the fridge. It'll last you for 2 weeks if it was good fresh cilantro instead of 2 days. Don't be afraid to smell it in the grocery store. Give it a pinch, give it a smell. If you can't smell it, you can't taste it. If you can't smell it, it's not going to have those good compounds that we want anyway, because it's been sitting on that shelf and it's not going to have the flavor that we're looking for. So obviously there are people in this world that are not cilantro people. So if you're not a cilantro person, then you could add something else to it if you wanted to. You could, this is a great dish to stir in the dark leafy green itself. So if you wanted to really finely slice up some collard greens or kale or spinach, even frozen spinach, this would be an awesome thing to add to that as well. So plenty of other ways to add that green color to this without necessarily adding cilantro, but I love cilantro. So I'm gonna rip some of this up. Now, if you're using a lot of cilantro, then it actually, a lot of times they grow in sand or the soil is very sandy. So what you can do is unwrap the entire thing and put it in a little bowl or a bucket and just kind of gently, because it is very fragile. So that's why we're adding it at the, adding it to the very end, not mixing it in there because it'll heat up too much and then we won't be able to taste it at all. But that way you'll start to see some of the sediment that actually sinks to the bottom of the bowl, and it might surprise you. So if we're just using, I just used a little bit. So like I said, I did already rinse mine off, but I'm not afraid of a little dirt, but there can be certain, it's a green, it's a vegetable or an herb. And so we do want to make sure that we rinse it off there. Cilantro is one of the highest nitric oxide producing herbs. That's our vessel opener that can help lower our blood pressure. It can also help prevent that cascade of inflammation to build up plaque in our linings of our arteries. So lots of reasons we want that good leafy green in there. All right, I think what I'm gonna finish with is just a little bit of information on the whole dish itself in terms of nutrition, since this is again making about 8 servings, so we divided it by 8. And I'm gonna do a little bit of TV magic here for you so that you get to see what this looked like. And yeah, I can see my red lentils have already absorbed a lot of the liquid and they have already started to split almost. So it'd really be just about making sure that the sweet potatoes are done. So I'm gonna get my, nope, I already used that bowl. I wanted to use a bowl to make the colors contrast. So let's see, I'm gonna use green one. Okay, let me move this out of the way. And, oops, I never actually, you know, you can leave the cilantro leaves whole. I'm just gonna roughly chop them. So what that means is I'm probably gonna run the knife over it just one time here. And again, it's okay that there's stems in there. All depends on, I said one time and then I did it twice. But there we go. It's just a rough chop. Again, we don't want to do it too finely, and you don't want to do it too far in advance actually, because it'll start to sit there and lose its flavor, lose its texture. So we don't want to do that either. So I am going to take the lid off here for a second. I'm going to set this right here on my towel, and then it smells really good. So for a little bit of TV magic here, I am going to show you our, ta-da, sweet potato tempeh. What else do we put in there? Lentil, chili, stew. So there you have it, chock full of goodness. There is about, honestly, less than 300 calories per serving in this bowl here. So it is hardly anything, but it's got 20 grams of protein, which is more than a third of what I would need personally in a day. So it's got quite a bit of protein, but you can also, you can add something else to it if you need a little bit more. So I'm going to put my lid back on. And then it's got 18 grams of dietary fiber. So over half of a day's worth of fiber in this one dish, which is phenomenal. That will also, as many of you know, bind to your bad cholesterol, that LDL, help get that out of our body, help prevent certain types of cancer, especially colon and rectal cancer. It will also help manage our blood sugar, prevent those really high spikes. It'll help keep us full. It'll help make sure we're going to the bathroom. So lots of great reasons for that fiber. And then there's over 1,000 milligrams of potassium in here. Potassium counterbalances sodium when it comes to blood pressure management too. So we want to make sure we're eating plenty of potassium. So over 1,000 milligrams in this dish right here. And then one other nutrient that gets talked about a lot is iron. So there's actually 11 milligrams of iron in one serving of this dish. And that is over a day's worth of what a man needs. Now for women, especially women that are still menstruating, then they need about 18 milligrams of iron per day. And that obviously to help, get the blood to regenerate. So that's an important part of that. Pregnant women need more. Pregnant women need about 27 milligrams of iron every day. So here we go at 18. That's pretty significant in terms of what they would need throughout the day. So it's also coupled with vitamin C. Your bell pepper is a phenomenal source of vitamin C. Canned tomatoes are a great source of vitamin C. So we don't need to be worried about whether or not that iron is getting absorbed if it's coming from a plant food or not. It is. This is a perfect dish. I'm really hungry.